Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk at the Beanley Nonprofit Conference. I think it's fantastic that it's going ahead virtually, and I think it's a testament to the versatility of neighbourhood centres and community development workers and the skills that Anthony brings to the table. I think it's great how neighbourhood centres in particular often look for creative solutions to social problems. And that'll be a little bit of what I'm talking about today as I talk about going back to our roots in community work. I'll just share my screen with you all. There we go. And I will just start my slideshow. Great. So it is the late 19th century. It's the Victorian era. London is a city rife with the widespread effects of industrialisation and urbanisation. It saw consistent increases in crime and poverty and a growing population of uneducated children and adults. As Charles Booth maps the dreary streets of London town, he takes out bottles of coloured ink to highlight the suburbs living in poverty and crowded conditions. The gap between rich and poor is wide. 30% of Londoners are living in poverty. Streets where slums existed, well, Charles Booth coloured them black, which Booth described as lower class, vicious and semi-criminal. Light blue streets are described as poor, 18 shillings to 21 shillings a week for a moderate family. On the other side of Hornsey Road are two streets coloured dark blue, defined as very poor, casual, chronic want. And the streets with the wealthy residents are coloured red. So in a primitive way, Booth is data mapping local neighbourhoods. He's looking at the demographics of each street and locality. He identifies the features of each place, the type of housing, social infrastructure, levels of income, crime rates and education. Charles Booth, he conducted surveys and interviewed local leaders to fully understand what was going on in local communities. His work would be used to introduce things like the age pension and free school meals for poor children. In 1884, two other social reformers emerged from London. Church of England minister Canon Samuel Barnett and his wife Henrietta, who was a school teacher. And they recognised the growing levels of poverty in London's East End. They purchased a building called Toynbee Hall in the middle of the Whitechapel neighbourhood. Their approach was different than traditional forms of charity in which welfare was simply just handed out to those in need. Instead, they felt it was their Christian duty to work with the people themselves, allowing them to identify what their issues were and target the underlying causes of poverty. The Barnetts provided residence to university graduates at Toynbee Hall who could provide local people with education and conduct research on the systemic causes of disadvantage. As they lived amongst the people, the residents of Toynbee Hall ran social groups, art classes, community programs, and addressed local issues. They were engaged in political activism and lobbied for the welfare of local labourers. This local place-based approach to addressing community problems began spreading, and the local halls became known as settlement houses, named after the settlements, otherwise known as neighbourhoods, in which they were located. And throughout the 1880s, the idea of settlement houses spread to the United States. Members of the social gospel movement, inspired by the works of Tolstoy and others, visited Toynbee Hall to see how settlement houses worked with, rather than for, local people. Most notable of these was Jane Addams, who established Hull House in Chicago in 1889. Hull House was a rundown mansion in the poor immigrant areas of Chicago. After Jane had visited the Barnetts in London in 1887, she established the United States' first settlement house using female university graduates. Local research was conducted on the local causes of poverty, illness, and housing. Working with the population, community programs were established providing education, medical care, social groups, even things like garbage collection. Jane Addams went on to become the founding mother of the modern social work movement. She was the first woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931 for her work in establishing settlement houses, promoting world peace, and encouraging social reform, especially in the area of women's rights. Settlements were characterised not by a set of services, but an approach. If the original stimulus came from sponsors outside the neighbourhood, the approach consisted of moving into the needy area and then reaching out in a friendly way to the neighbours and deciding together with them what was wrong and what was needed. In cases where the initiative came from Indigenous neighbourhood leaders or organisations, the program has been flexible and reflected neighbourhood judgment about priorities. And because of this, settlements have ranged widely in the activities they've provided. They pioneered in nursing services, clinics and convalescent homes. They've taught English and citizenship. Kindergartens began there, as did experiments in trade and vocational training. Settlement workers studied housing conditions, working hours, sanitation, child labour, and they use these studies to stimulate protective legislation. They work to remedy abuses by loan sharks and pawn shops. And always there are activities which brought fun and fulfilment to life, things like music, art and theatre. The list is as varied and as changing as the needs. These settlement houses continue to spread around the Western world, eventually making their way to Australia in the 1960s and early 1970s. In 1973, they received federal support through the Australian Assistance Plan under the Whitlam government. And today across the world, they are known by many names: settlement houses, neighbourhood houses, community centres. But in Queensland, we like to call them neighbourhood centres. Neighbourhood centres have evolved over time, yet their roots in local community-focused activities is still a main feature of their work. Some neighbourhood centres have formed larger corporate structures and amalgamated to pull together resources, while others have remained as local community-governed associations conducting grassroots work. Some centres are operating social enterprises to offer local employment opportunities and increase funding, while others operate without any government funding to retain full community ownership. Many are responding to the natural disasters in Queensland in their neighbourhoods, and most respond to people experiencing personal and family crisis. Due to their history, neighbourhood centres have a unique identity in today's human services sector. Key features are that they're located in geographical areas that impact certain places. They conduct local place-based community development. They run activities which build social capital and community connection. Where they offer services and support, they're community-orientated services and support. And they work with, in partnership, local businesses, clubs, governments, NGOs, health services, faith-based organisations, and other stakeholders to address local social concerns. Neighbourhood centres facilitate citizen-led community change and support people experiencing hardship. And now for over 135 years, They've continued to assist with housing, employment, advocacy, and poverty, while offering playgroups and activities and workshops and migrant support. They offer flexible solutions to local problems, each offering different responses relevant to their own unique local area. So as we consider the history of neighbourhood centres and that of the modern social work movement, we must reflect on some of the core foundations of what it means to support local people and local communities. All too often, it's easy for community organisations to get trapped in the McDonaldisation of our services. And McDonald's has been really effective at setting up a local franchise in each area, offering a standard menu that's efficient and convenient. They even offer free Wi-Fi as well. And to some degree, community organisations have become more effective at offering standard service delivery menus to community needs in a more cost-effective, efficient way. Even for some organisations, we have 1-800 numbers, where ordering a service almost becomes like ordering a pizza from Pizza Hut. However, as much as I'm a fan of the odd takeaway meal, nutrition is a much bigger issue than grabbing a Big Mac and fries. And likewise, people and communities are far more complex and diverse in their issues for us to take just a franchise approach to all communities. Firstly, the early social reformers recognised that traditional approaches to welfare did not address the systemic problems of disadvantage. In the words of Desmond Tutu, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. Many of these early organisations formed close partnerships with students from universities to research the deep causes of poverty and then design responses, not just around the symptom of the problem, but around the cause of the problem. And their responses involve the participation of the people themselves in the work. In London, they facilitated local people to become their own political activists to address workforce issues. Kindergartens and playgroups were eventually run by the community, empowering local women and increasing their opportunities. In the United States, projects occurred to reduce illness through things as straightforward as just establishing a local rubbish collection system. Many of our organisations in the modern context put all of our emphasis on the symptoms of problems through the handing out of food or the giving of a voucher or delivering a program. Now, on the outside, funding these programs appears to be the ideal solution for government and other funding bodies. When someone is hungry, the solution is to just feed them. It looks like you're fixing the problem. But addressing the causes of hunger, that's a lot less appealing to funding bodies. That's more complicated and long-term or too hard or a wicked problem, as they say. For many of us, our evaluation is focused on what we're doing or on individual outcomes for service users, which is all well and good. We need to know if we're making an individual difference to someone's life. But these early social reformers, their research explored what the corporate issues for communities were, the systems and the structures that needed to change in order to release people from the oppression of poverty and poor housing and other disadvantage. This approach requires a rediscovery of community development methods, working with local communities to enable them to address their own issues rather than just a top-down service delivery approach. It will mean forming close relationships with university and other research organisations to more deeply explore community issues. It will mean listening to groups of people and connecting them with the resources they need to make change. It will mean forming partnerships across many different sectors to address multifaceted social problems. and it will mean putting the local community as a key focus of our work, rather than the organisation or the professional practitioner. Secondly, and closely related to the first, the Barnetts and the Adams of the early social reform movement did not offer standard services across all of their settlement house locations. They recognised that each community was different and the issues in each neighbourhood were different. Hull House in Chicago had a high immigrant population, therefore needed a different approach to Toynbee Hall in the London slums, who were affected by industrialisation. Neighbourhood houses have continued this tradition. The programs at the North Townsville Community Hub with monsoon-affected residents is different from the Tara Neighbourhood Centre that work with drought-affected locals. Inner city Brisbane neighbourhood centres work with a different homeless population than Maroochy Neighbourhood Centre. In the community sector, it seems we often like to come up with models that can be replicated in each community to suit our funders, which has worked well for us, particularly after the austerity measures during the global financial crisis. However, increasingly, funders are realising that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't fit everyone, and there are increasing numbers of people falling through the gaps in the system. Funders are starting to look for local place-based responses to local issues. We can't approach communities with just a standard menu of Big Mac style services, because communities are diverse places with complex issues and complex needs. And this will often mean that we need to take a hard look at the services that we're offering and ask whether they are really suitable for our communities. They may keep us in a job, but do our services exist for us? Or are they there for the people that we serve? It may mean keeping overall models of service delivery, but tweaking them on the ground to make sure they're relevant to the local community that we work in. So, for instance, a counselling service in Weipa looks very different from a counselling service in Fortitude Valley or in Bow Desert. The community partnerships that are formed in Toowoomba may be very different to the ones that are formed on the Gold Coast. This again requires listening to local people and really understanding the complex issues they are facing in order to make sure what our organisation is offering is suitable for all types of people in our community. The social reformers were especially concerned about disadvantaged people groups and the gaps between the haves and the have-nots. Thirdly, the early settlement houses were not afraid to be involved in social activism. As well as working with the people, Jane Addams was a key leader in the women's suffrage movement, and the activities of Hull House sought to empower women facing poverty and disadvantage. Toynbee Hall was involved in activism to lobby for workers' rights during an era when workers were being exploited and working conditions were extremely poor. And I recognise that for many of our organisations, we've been given funding contracts that restrict us from lobbying on social issues, while for other organisations, they may have more freedoms to be more outspoken on social issues. The early social reformers, the work went hand in hand with advocacy and empowering individuals to create structural change. We must look for opportunities to encourage local people to be involved in social reform on the issues that affect them. As community work professionals, we often think that these need to be big social justice issues. But we need to use our discernment to figure out what the social issues are on a local level and find strategies to create social change with local people in a way that brings about sustainable change. So ask yourself, what are the common social themes in my community? How are they being addressed on a local level? Who do I need to build partnerships with in order to address these? And advocacy doesn't always need to be boisterous, angry, and loud. The suffragette movement was born in Manchester, the centre of textile production in England. Women in Britain began lobbying in mass numbers for social and political change, often creating and brandishing embroidered and patchwork banners of silk and velvet. Now, even today, there are many local community groups involved in the gentle art of craftivism. They stitch hankies and they send them to local politicians with words like, "Don't blow your opportunity." If lobbying is forbidden in your funding contract, then get creative. There are groups around making quilts and artworks and so forth, and using these to capture the attention of people who are decision makers in policy reform. We can learn a lot from our foremothers and our forefathers as we tackle the modern problems of our time. We need to not only treat the symptoms of social issues, but address the underlying causes. We need to be flexible enough to change our approach to be relevant to local communities. And we need to stop being afraid to speak and act upon the issues that affect the communities that we work with, in bold but gentle ways, in order to create neighbourhoods that are self-directed, connected and resourceful. That was our vision at the QFCA when we sat down to think about what the end game was. We discussed a lot of ideas, but at the end of the day, we just wanted to see neighbourhoods transformed into thriving communities that are self-directed, connected and resourceful. It's a vision very similar to Charles Booth, James Adams, Samuel and Henrietta Barnett at Toynbee Hall and Hull House, and the movement of neighbourhood centres across the globe. I am just having a look through for any questions that are in the chat, or if you'd like me to expand on anything.
There's no questions per se, Chris, but just some great comments. Fantastic introduction is a comment. Really enjoying what you're saying and aligns perfectly to the Logan Together movement and the work that is happening.
Excellent. Thank you all for your really positive feedback. I really appreciate it.
Hi, Chris. What you said I found really poignant, particularly the McDonaldization of some of the services in our sector. I found that quite interesting. It sort of tied in with what I was talking about as well. Like, you can't really have one size fits all, but a lot of things are going that way at the moment.
Yeah, that's very true. And to some degree, I think the funding environment actually caused that. After the global financial crisis, there was a lot more of a tightening of the belt in community services. And governments and funders particularly look for efficiency in the way that community services operated on shoestring budgets. But I think the consequence of that now is that we're seeing that many people are falling through the cracks in the system. And there is a consequence for not conducting community development and not having the emphasis on community development and addressing the root causes. Eventually, they're going to leak out somehow.
All right, Chris. We seem to have one open question here. Angela from the Logan Together Backbone team has said, "Chris, can I meet you after COVID restrictions are lifted?"
Yeah, sure. And you can meet me virtually beforehand too.
Okay, well, after the conference is completed, I can share contact details if you're both happy to do that.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
All right, that's fantastic. Okay, so thank you so much for your time today, Chris. That presentation was something else. So thank you so much for participating and enlightening us today on the history of the social work movement and how it's progressed through time. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Anthony.